Aviation is a rich man's playground. It is a brutal, capital-intensive machine engineered by billionaires and subsidized by oil-rich states. Look at the titans of the sky. Emirates. Backed by the endless wealth of Dubai. Delta and United. Kept on life support by multi-billion-dollar US government bailouts. Ryanair. Operating in the wealthiest consumer market on earth. To survive here, you need cash, power, and flawless infrastructure. Which is why, for decades, Western economists agreed on one absolute rule: Africa cannot build a globally dominant airline. The continent was deemed too unstable. The markets, too fractured. The infrastructure, too broken. And for a long time, the data backed them up. Iconic national carriers from Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa crashed into bankruptcy, victims of political meddling and catastrophic mismanagement. But right in the middle of this hostile landscape, one country decided to defy the gravity of economic logic: Ethiopia. A landlocked nation in East Africa. A country that, in the late 20th century, became synonymous in Western media with famine, civil war, and economic devastation. A nation with a per capita GDP that is a fraction of the global average. Yet today, while Western legacy carriers are cutting routes and begging for state loans, this exact country runs the most profitable, most technologically advanced, and most aggressive airline in African history, Ethiopian Airlines. They don't just dominate African skies, they are actively outcompeting European and American titans on their own long-haul routes. They did it without oil money. They did it without Western dependency. And they did it while operating under a Marxist dictatorship, through multiple famines, and amidst brutal civil wars. How did a country the world wrote off build the undisputed king of African aviation? The answer isn't a miracle. It's a masterclass in ruthless corporate strategy, hidden geopolitics, and a secret pact made over half a century ago that the West deeply regrets. To understand the rise of Ethiopian Airlines, we first have to understand the invisible trap designed to keep African aviation grounded. It's called the colonial hub-and-spoke trap. In the mid-20th century, as African nations gained independence, they inherited a bizarre logistical nightmare. If you wanted to fly from Lagos, Nigeria to Nairobi, Kenya, two major African cities, you couldn't just fly across the continent. There were no commercial routes. Instead, you had to fly north to London or Paris, wait for a connecting flight, and then fly all the way back down to Africa. European airlines controlled the skies, extracting billions in revenue from African passengers while leaving the continent physically disconnected from itself. When independent African leaders realized this, they tried to fight back. Every newly free nation wanted its own pride of the skies. Nigeria created Nigeria Airways. Ghana created Ghana Airways. They bought expensive planes, hired foreign consultants, and slapped their national flags on the fuselage. But they all made the exact same fatal mistake. They treated their national airlines like political piggy banks. Politicians appointed their unqualified cousins as CEOs. Government ministers demanded free first-class tickets for their entire extended families. Routes were chosen not because they made financial sense, but because a politician wanted a direct flight to his favorite shopping destination in Europe. The results were catastrophic. Nigeria Airways collapsed under billions of dollars of debt, leaving a fleet of rotting aircraft on the tarmac. Air Afrique, a massive consortium of 11 French-speaking nations, dissolved in a mess of political infighting. South African Airways, once a giant, burned through billions in taxpayer bailouts before entering restructuring. The aviation industry realized that operating an airline in Africa was a financial death sentence. High taxes, astronomical fuel costs, and unstable currencies meant that even if you filled every seat, you would still lose money. By all accounts of economic theory, Ethiopia should have been the biggest failure of them all. The year is 1945. Ethiopia's visionary emperor, Haile Selassie, looks out at a world rapidly modernizing. He realizes that as a landlocked nation surrounded by hostile colonial powers, Ethiopia is vulnerable. If it cannot control its access to the outside world, it will be strangled economically. He needed an airline. But he knew Ethiopians didn't have the technical expertise to build one from scratch. So, he did something radical. He reached across the Atlantic and struck a deal with the devil of capitalism, Trans World Airlines, TWA, the American aviation giant owned by the eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. TWA brought the planes, the pilots, and the mechanics. But Haile Selassie inserted a brilliant, non-negotiable clause into the contract. The American experts had a strict expiration date. Their explicit job was to train their own Ethiopian replacements, from the baggage handlers to the captains, and then get out. This brings us to rule number 1 of the Ethiopian strategy: absolute self-reliance. While other African nations hired foreign crews to fly their planes for decades, Ethiopia built a massive, state-of-the-art aviation academy in Addis Ababa. By 1971, the entire company, from the boardroom to the cockpit, was run entirely by Ethiopians. But then, the ultimate test arrived. In 1974, a bloody communist revolution overthrew the emperor. A brutal military junta known as the Derg took power, aligning Ethiopia with the Soviet Union. History tells us exactly what happens when a communist military dictatorship takes over a commercial corporation. Nationalization, purges of competent managers, ideological propaganda, and swift economic collapse. Western aviation experts braced for the inevitable death of Ethiopian Airlines. But what happened next defies explanation. The airline's management did something incredibly dangerous. They walked into the offices of the ruthless military dictators and gave them an ultimatum. They told the junta, "You can run the country, but you cannot touch the airline. If you put political appointees in our boardrooms, if you interfere with our finances, the planes will stop flying, and the country will go broke." Astonishingly, the dictators blinked. They signed a decree guaranteeing that Ethiopian Airlines would operate as a purely capitalistic, profit-driven entity, completely insulated from political madness. Think about the sheer insanity of this dynamic. Outside the hangar doors, the country was enduring a devastating civil war, crushing communist price controls, and a historic famine that drew global headlines. But inside the hangar doors, Ethiopian engineers were using cutting-edge American tech, tracking every single dollar of profit, and expanding their global network. While the country's politics were aligned with Moscow, its airline was doing business with Wall Street. When the communist regime finally fell in 1991, Ethiopia was economically shattered. But Ethiopian Airlines was profitable, debt-free, and hungry for global dominance. Enter German Wake in 2004, and later, toward Jebromariam, the strategic masterminds who looked at the global aviation map and noticed a massive, multi-billion-dollar flaw in how Western airlines operated. For decades, European carriers like Lufthansa, Air France, and British Airways treated Africa like a cash cow. They would fly from Europe to an African capital, pick up passengers, bring them to Europe, and charge exorbitant premiums. Ethiopian Airlines decided to flip the entire global script. They introduced a strategy called Vision 2010, followed by Vision 2025. The goal: stop acting like a local carrier, and start acting like Dubai. Look at the geography. Addis Ababa sits at a perfect crossroads. Ethiopian Airlines realized they could connect underserved cities across the globe through a single, massive hub. They didn't just connect Africa to Europe, they connected Africa to Africa, and then Africa to the world. They bought the youngest, most fuel-efficient fleet on the planet, becoming the first in Africa to fly the advanced Boeing 777 and the 787 Dreamliner. If an American businessman wanted to fly from Washington, D.C. to Lomé, Togo, he no longer had to fly through Paris. He flew through Addis Ababa on a brand new aircraft, at half the price, with world-class service. But their absolute stroke of genius came during the global catastrophe of 2020. When the pandemic hit, global passenger traffic plummeted by over 90%. Iconic airlines around the world collapsed into bankruptcy or demanded billions in taxpayer bailouts. Ethiopian Airlines didn't fire a single employee. They didn't ask for a single dollar of government aid. Instead, in a matter of days, they unbolted the passenger seats from dozens of their brand new passenger jets, converting them into makeshift cargo planes. While the world was locked down, Ethiopian became the literal lifeline of the globe, flying millions of tons of personal protective equipment, vaccines, and e-commerce goods between China, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In a year where the aviation industry lost a collective $118 billion, Ethiopian Airlines turned a massive profit. They had officially beaten the West at their own game. Today, Ethiopian Airlines is no longer just an airline. It is a sprawling empire. They own the largest aviation academy in Africa, a massive cargo terminal, a chain of luxury hotels, and they actively manage and take equity stakes in other struggling African airlines, rewriting the aviation landscape across the continent. So, what is the real lesson of the Ethiopian miracle? The world often looks at developing nations through a lens of pity, assuming that progress requires endless foreign intervention, charity, or Western mimicry. But Ethiopian Airlines proved that the ultimate competitive advantage isn't oil money, and it isn't geographic luck. It is institutional discipline. By building a wall between politics and business, by investing ruthlessly in their own people rather than relying on foreign saviors, and by spotting the structural blind spots of legacy global giants, they achieved the impossible. They proved that even when you are operating from a landlocked nation in a fractured market, if you execute with absolute, unwavering discipline, the sky is not the limit. It is your home market. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the business strategies that reshape our world, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment down below on which corporate empire we should uncover next, and we'll see you in the next video.